If you had to say, excuse me, if you had to say what this man was most famous for, would it be A, 16 years of distinguished military service, B, 2 moderately successful novels, C, an intensely awkward appearance on the game show Wife Swap, or D, his attempt to cheat his way to £1 million on popular quiz show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? What would your answer be? Obviously, for the vast majority of people watching this video, it's the last one. This is Major Charles Ingram, a man who has gone down in history for a spectacularly bad attempt at a spectacular heist. This is the story of the man who tried, and failed, to cheat ITV out of £1 million. Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Infuriatingly, there's a question mark in the name but not in the logo, is a quiz show that started life on Britain's ITV network in 1998. The rules are pretty simple. Up to 10 contestants are invited into the studio and seated at computer terminals. Ex-Tiswas host Chris Tarrant then asks them all a question that requires them to put 4 answers in order. So, for example, the question might be, put these letters in the order that they appear in the word alphabetical. A, B, B, A, C, E, D, H. The correct answer to which would, of course, be B, D, A, C, I think. Look, the actual questions they used were generally less confusing. Most of the time, most people got them right, but just being right didn't win you any prizes. You also had to be quick. Whoever inputted the correct answer in the shortest time would then be invited to the big exciting chair in the middle of the studio to play the main game and potentially win £1 million. The main game consisted of 15 randomly chosen multiple choice questions. Each correctly answered question upped your prize money until you got to the 15th and final question, a correct answer to which would win you £1 million. Just one wrong answer, however, and you'd be out of the game. Along the way, the questions got steadily harder, but there were some safety nets. First, at the £1,000 and £32,000 marks, you could essentially bank your money. After these points, you were guaranteed to leave with something, but you still stood to lose any money beyond these tiers if you gave a wrong answer. And secondly, there were the lifelines, 3 single-use helping hands that you could play just once per game. 50-50 would eliminate 2 wrong answers from the 4 available, significantly increasing your odds of guessing correctly if you didn't know which answer to pick. Ask the Audience allowed you to take a poll of the studio audience. They would vote on what they believed to be the correct answer using electronic handsets. More often than not, the collective wisdom of the crowd would make the correct answer glaringly obvious, and often make you feel like an idiot for not knowing it in the first place, but that was a small price to pay for an almost guaranteed correct answer. The third and final lifeline was a little less helpful. Phone a Friend allowed you to call up a pre-selected pal with whom you'd have 30 seconds to discuss the question. Hopefully they'd know the answer, but it was never guaranteed. And by the way, Millionaire made its debut in 1998, when not everyone could look up the answer to anything on their pocket supercomputer in under a minute. So that's how the game functioned, and at first glance you might think it's a little lacking in tension. Why allow the contestants to bank their money? Wouldn't it be more exciting if they had to risk it all with every single question? And how much fun could it be to watch one person slowly mull over a series of multiple choice questions? Where was the dramatic tension? Where was the competitive element? The answer is simple. It was all in the presentation. Millionaire was glamorous, it was big, there was tense music, dramatic lighting effects, and a host who was constantly playing with contestants and upping the ante. One of his favourite tricks was to write out a cheque for the amount of money on the line, ready to hand it over if the contestant gave a right answer, or tear it up if they got it wrong. Oh, and Tarrant also really liked going to a commercial break at moments of peak tension. At the time, all of this showmanship was pretty new and unprecedented, especially on UK television networks. As a British person, I'm rather embarrassed to show you this, but many of our game shows at the time looked like this. Far from giving away £1 million, both the prizes and the production values on British game shows were delightfully naff. You stood to win at most a camcorder, or a boat you'd never ever use. Even the incredibly wacky British TV game show The Crystal Maze rewarded winning participants with, at the absolute most, a budget day trip, a session of dry slope skiing, or a canoe trip on the River Wye, to give two stunning examples. A game show giving away a cool £1 million actual pounds, therefore, was in an entirely different league. Because of this, it was a massive hit. A contestant winning big, or in some cases failing abjectly, sorry John, would make, well, not headlines, but definitely news the next day. And it would be something that people would talk about. Very quickly, watching Millionaire became a national pastime. This was good news for ITV, of course. There'd been some doubt among executives about giving away such vast sums of money on a regular basis, but the show turned out to be popular enough to do just that and turn a massive profit too. This was thanks in large part to ad revenue from those many tense commercial breaks, of course, but the show also made a healthy profit off the people trying to participate. To get on the show, you'd call a premium rate number. You'd be put through to a computer which would ask you a randomly selected trivia question. Answer correctly, and you'd be in with a shot at getting a call back from a real, live human. The production team would pick about 100 people to call back with a second, closest to question. This was a question where you weren't really expected to get the answer exactly right, just to give your nearest approximation. They'd generally be a bit absurd. How many inches away is the moon from the Earth, for example? The 10 people who got the closest to the correct answer would be invited to participate in the fastest finger first round on the show, with 1 or 2 of them going on to play for $1 million in the main game. The promise of that windfall was enough to keep people calling back again and again, ensuring that ITV had plenty of money to be giving away. So, that's the show, at least as it was in 1999. Now, let's meet the Ingrams. Charles and Diana, no relation, married in 1989. Charles was a military man, having joined the British Army a few years before in 1987. He quickly rose through the ranks to become a major in 1995. And, in case you take a look at his big, smiling, slightly schoolboy-looking face and think that his promotions were undeserved, quite the contrary. He'd taken part in peacekeeping missions in Bosnia, and as far as I can tell, had a pretty exemplary record of military service. He and his wife had 3 children, a nice house, and all the trappings of a basically decent life. They also had massive debt, but we'll get onto that later. It was never Charles's idea to go on the show. He wasn't really into quizzes. He probably preferred, I don't know, military stuff. Tanks, marching, shiny shoes. Diana, however, was obsessed with the show, as was her brother, Adrian Pollock. Adrian had been the first of the trio to appear on Millionaire, followed by Diana a little later, and finally Charles was persuaded to give it a go in September 2001. And yes, he gave it a good try, but his performance, at least to begin with, wasn't particularly barnstorming. By the end of the first day of filming, he'd already used 2 lifelines and had only got as far as the £4,000 mark. The only lifeline left in his arsenal was 50-50, objectively the most useless lifeline. Most of the production crew assumed he'd make it another question or 2 before being knocked out of the running. But that was, very much, not the case. When Charles came back the next day to continue his run, he was a man transformed. Whereas before he'd been incredibly uncertain and hesitant, now he was still incredibly uncertain, but somehow kept getting things right. This was especially amazing as several times he professed to have no idea what the correct answer was, before going on to gamble a significant amount of money on a random guess and get it right. This wasn't how people usually played the game. Most contestants might take a punt on these questions because they'd banked their money and it wouldn't matter if they were wrong. But generally speaking, if there was money at stake, most contestants would either play it safe and walk away when they didn't know, or risk it only if they had a strong hunch. It wasn't the kind of game where you took a random guess more than once or twice in a run. Charles, on the other hand, appeared to be taking a wild stab in the dark again and again and again, and somehow winning each time. Presenter Chris Tarrant was simply blown away by this performance, convinced that it was going to make excellent television. Some production crew, though, were suspicious, not least because Ingram seemed to have developed a habit of saying each possible answer out loud, sometimes several times, before settling on a final choice for seemingly no reason. But, however certain they were that he was cheating, they couldn't, in the moment, figure out how he was doing it. And so the Major slowly and unsteadily bumbled his way to the £1 million question, despite not knowing any of the answers. The final question was no exception. A number 1 followed by 100 zeros is known by what name? A. Google, B. Megatron, C. Gigabit, D. Nanomole. Charles once again pulled his routine of saying all the answers out loud. He had, he announced, no idea what a Google was, but he was fairly sure the answer was nanomole. Within minutes, however, he fully reversed his position and plumped for Google, the answer that mere moments ago he had announced he had no idea of the definition of. And, to everyone's astonishment, this random guess was yet again correct. Charles Ingram had just won £1 million, only the third contestant in the history of the show ever to achieve such a feat. A sidebar. When someone did win $1 million, confetti cannons were set to go off, filling the studio with twinkling bits of silver paper. But the production team had been so doubtful about Ingram's chances that, as he approached the £1 million question, the confetti guy wasn't ready. Despite the much umming and ahhing Ingram did on his way to his final answer, they only just prepped the cannons in time. Anywho, he'd done it. He'd won. His wife was invited down out of the audience to celebrate with him, and... oh. Is it just me, or does she look not so much delighted as intensely annoyed? Well, whatever. Chris Tarrant didn't notice a thing. He was too busy heartily congratulating the Major on his success. It was, all in all, pretty spectacular. But was it also a sham? ITV was so suspicious of Ingram that they took the unusual step of having him searched on his way out. It was so unusual that nobody was really trained to do it, so the head of marketing stepped in to give the Major the TSA treatment. Nothing was found, so reluctantly, ITV popped some very resentful champagne and sullenly had Charles and Diana whisked off to a luxury hotel for the night. The show would have been broadcast in the next few days, giving producers a very short window in which to figure out if Charles was cheating, and challenge him on it if so. But that was fine because it didn't take them very long at all. A sound engineer noticed that someone in the audience was coughing whenever Charles said the correct answer out loud. The same person, in fact, one of the fastest finger first contestants, a man named Tequin Wittek. More on him later. Now that they had a theory, the producers were confident enough to pull the episode. The CEO of Celador called Charles and told him they had suspicions, an announcement which Charles seemed to take phenomenally calmly, given that they were essentially yanking a £1 million check from his grasp. The CEO's next call, then, was to the police, who wasted no time in taking in Charles, Diana, and Tequin Wittek for questioning. In the case of Charles and Diana, they went from sipping complimentary champagne in a luxury hotel to being questioned in a distinctly non-luxury interrogation room in a matter of hours. And, if you think that's a bad-sounding day, you also have to bear in mind one of the most surreal things about this whole debacle, which is that it happened around the 11th of September 2001. Someone attempting to cheat on Millionaire was massive news, but given that there was other, much more massive news happening in the world at the time, it didn't come to light for at least a little while. By the time it did start showing up in the news cycle, Charles, Diana, and Tequin had all been charged with procuring the execution of a valuable security by deception, aka trying to nick £1 million off a game show. The trial commenced in 2003, and it was the subject of some very intense media interest. It was just such a good story that nobody could help but be curious, especially when it came with a series of its own ironic twists, like the jury being overwhelmed by a fit of uncontrollable coughing at one point during the trial. As the trial went on, a series of juicy revelations emerged. Here's, allegedly, how it all went down. Firstly, there was the matter of how the Ingrams had gotten on the show in the first place. Contestant selection was supposed to be random, so it struck producers as odd that Charles was actually the third member of his family to be on the show. The first had been Diana's brother, and the second Diana herself. Had they found some way to game the system in order to up their chances of getting on TV? As it turned out, that was exactly what they'd done. Diana and her brother, Adrian Pollock, were quiz-obsessed, Adrian in particular. He was the first to get on the show after using the extremely sophisticated tactic of calling up that premium rate number around 1,700 times. He kept trying, in fact, until he had been on the show not once but 3 times, finally making it to the hot seat on his third attempt and winning £32,000 to put towards his phone bill. On the subject of calling a premium rate line 1,700 times, Adrian, Charles, and Diana were all in debt. Adrian's business was going badly, and according to a confusing statement from Diana, he had gotten into further debt by illegally procuring money from a bank. I don't think that means bank robbery, by the way, but perhaps relying on a loan form or something similar. As for Charles and Diana, they were around £50,000 in the hole, which is a tense situation to be in for anyone, but it's worth mentioning that they also had a massive 5-bedroom house for their 3 children. They were in debt, but it was a very middle-class kind of debt. Charles didn't make himself seem any more sympathetic when Chris Tarrant asked him what he'd do with the money. Instead of saying, "I'd get my family out of debt and provide for my children," he instead went with, "I'd buy my daughters a pony." Now is also a good time to introduce Tequin Whittock. Tequin was a college lecturer who was also very into Millionaire. He'd got in touch with Adrian after noticing that Adrian had been on the show several times. Tequin wanted to know what the secret was to getting on TV, and Adrian was more than happy to tell him. In fact, Adrian became a sort of mentor to Tequin, and taught him his special technique of calling up 1,000 times in a row in order to improve his chances. Tequin, by the way, was also in debt, and again, it was a quite middle-class debt. He'd run up a big bill on his credit cards by paying for private school for his children. So, Diana, Adrian, and Tequin are all millionaire-obsessed and all riddled with debt. And they certainly weren't the only people in the UK in the early 2000s to fit into that category. Indeed, at the time, there was a whole community of people obsessed with the show. They'd log on to internet forums to discuss tips and techniques, and even work together by sharing the actual answers to some of the qualification questions. Diana and Andrew and Tequin weren't necessarily part of any of these millionaire-obsessed syndicates, but they were certainly adjacent to them. So they had the knowledge needed to ensure that they could get on the show. Uniquely, Adrian had also built a practice fastest finger first machine to give them a good chance of getting in the hot seat once they had got on TV. All of this explains how they were quite so proficient at getting on the show in the first place, and why they were so desperate for a big win. And all of this was basically sort of against the rules of the show, but not really illegal. The first allegations that something truly against the law happened concerned the first night of the show. The alleged story is this. The Ingrams insisted on bringing an extra guest along, Adrian. A harassed producer agreed, even though really each contestant was only allowed a single guest. If he'd known how much trouble Adrian was going to be, he probably wouldn't have made this allowance, because multiple times during filming, particularly when Charles got to the hot seat, Adrian was seen on his phone. That, even in 2001 when phones can't do very much, was a big no-no. Phones aren't allowed during a pub quiz when there's a 20 quid drink voucher on the line, let alone during a £1 million game show. The prosecution were quick to link Adrian being on his phone with hundreds of calls that Diana had placed to 4 different pages in the lead up to the show. What they were alleging basically is that on the first night the gang tried to cheat by strapping 4 pages to different parts of Charles's body and having Adrian call the pager that corresponded to the correct answer, a tactic that we may well have seen a version of more recently. In this case though, they couldn't prove a thing. They didn't know what Adrian had been doing on his phone, and Charles hadn't been searched that night. So while all that was a bit dodgy, it didn't amount to much. Plus, there was no phone signal in the studio, so even if they had tried to cheat in that way, it wouldn't have worked. So much for the first night. Roll on the second. After the first night of filming wrapped, it's alleged, the coughing plan was hatched. Tequin Whittock happened to have gotten into the fastest finger first seats on the same show as Charles. Since she sort of knew him via her brother Adrian, Diana called him up after Charles's first disastrous night and formed a plan for Tequin to cough when Charles said the right answer. Call logs reflect that Diana did indeed call Tequin, but she maintains that she was just innocently, well, phoning a friend. You know what happened next. Charles came back on for his second run and, after getting one question about cheese right all on his own, appeared uncertain about every single question that came thereafter. When he didn't seem to know the answer, he did what literally nobody ever did on the show, which was to ruminate at length, saying the answers out loud one after the other, until plumping for one seemingly at random. Watching footage provided by ITV of the taping shows that 19 times, Charles saying a correct answer is followed by a cough. Plus there's one time when he says the wrong answer and Diana coughs instead of Tequin. And another time when someone coughs in a way that sounds really suspiciously like they're saying the word no. Is that an open and shut case? Some people certainly thought so, but I'd like to take a minute to provide a little bit of balance. 1. The taped version of the episode shown to the jury. That had been put together by ITV, who openly admitted that they'd bumped up the volume of the significant coughs. It is, I have to say, quite unusual to allow the prosecution to literally make an edited supercut of their evidence before coming to court, but it was argued that that was the only sensible way to present the feeds from so many cameras and so many microphones. Charles, of course, maintains, quite reasonably, that the tape doesn't reflect what he would have heard while sitting in the hot seat. 2. Tequin Whittock had an uncontrollable cough. His doctor said so, everyone he knew said so, and he had been known all his life to carry around bottled water to help keep it under control. If you were picking someone to help you with a scheme that required them to cough on command, Tequin was pretty much the worst possible person you could pick. 3. The studio was hot and dry, and people cough all the time. As a matter of fact, you could take pretty much any episode of Millionaire and find people coughing when the contestant says the right answer. The defense did just this, in fact, pointing out that you could rake through footage of previous winner Judith Keppel and find examples where it really looked like she'd chosen her answer based on a coded cough from the audience. And 4. And this isn't really evidence, but the coughing major is just a really neat story. They cheated, they got caught, it's absurd and scandalous and really quite British. It centres on a game show, it's exciting. It's hard to deny that everyone, the press, the public, and quite probably the jury, wanted the Ingrams to be guilty because, well, that's a much better, much funnier, much more entertaining story. Now, to be clear, I'm pretty sure they did it. Charles's behaviour, picking answers that he professes not to know again and again and again, is just too obvious. But I also think there was enough reasonable doubt and tenuous evidence that they maybe shouldn't have been convicted. But convicted they were. All three were found guilty. Suspended sentences were handed out, ITV was off the hook for the million, and Charles, Diana, and Tequin were branded cheaters for the rest of their lives. And that's no small thing. Sure, the suspended sentences meant they didn't actually go to prison, but in every other way their lives were, at least for a few years, ruined. Charles was chucked from the military, couldn't get another job, and could barely step outside his house for years without being mocked or physically assaulted by people who felt as though it was okay to take a pop at him because he cheated on a game show. Even his kids had to change school because people wouldn't stop coughing at them. He and Diana went bankrupt, they lost friends, family members turned on them, the press savaged them, and some particularly stupid and evil youths went so far as to punch the family's dog, as if the family's pet would have literally anything at all to do with the whole debacle. At this point, you do have to wonder if any of this is remotely proportional. Even assuming that they are guilty, they cheated in a game show, were caught, disqualified, and had their reputation scuppered. Perhaps that should be the extent of it. Perhaps we could have stopped short of completely ruining his entire family's life. ITV, for their part, made out extremely well from the whole thing. They put together a popular drama called Quiz that told the whole story, featuring Tom from Succession, although he's doing some kind of clearly fake British accent in this one. Millionaire remained as popular as ever, and they even got to use footage of Charles to put together popular clips for their YouTube channel, further branding him a liar and a cheat in the process. It's safe to say that they almost certainly profited from the whole thing, even though the trial cost, you guessed it, more or less exactly £1 million. The three convicts did eventually manage to get their lives back on track. Tequin faded from public life, only emerging long enough to trademark his name so that a brand of cough syrup couldn't use it to promote their products. Charles managed to make some money by writing a couple of novels, and despite his less than stellar track record on game shows thus far, has popped up as a special guest on several since, including a couples edition of The Weakest Link. He and Diana also participated in a toe-curlingly awkward episode of Wife Swap with Jade Goody in 2003, and, in an unrelated toe-curling development, made the news once more when Charles sliced off 3 toes with a lawnmower in 2010. People still cough at the Ingrams in public, and they're likely to have to deal with that for the entire rest of their lives. But they're together, and they seem happy, and they're slowly moving on. They've almost certainly learned their lesson, and now that the furore has died down, people are a little less mad. The passing of time has given the whole affair a nostalgic tinge, making it seem almost like a daring heist gone wrong, rather than a life-ruining attempt at fraud. But what do you think? Did they do it? Did they get off lightly? Were they unfairly smeared by a media conglomerate? And is Charles's episode of Millionaire a painful viewing experience? Or one of the most interesting installments of the show ever broadcast?